The lunch period was halfway over when Dylan Kruger finally worked up the courage to stand up, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, as he walked across the Roosevelt Elementary cafeteria toward the table where Eric sat surrounded by Hell's Angels, who looked like they could break him in half without breathing hard. But who were eating sandwiches and making quiet conversation like this was Sunday dinner at Grandma's house, instead of the most surreal lunch period in the school's 40-year history. Dylan was 11 years old, tall for his age, wearing expensive Nike sneakers his corporate lawyer father had bought him, and carrying 3 years of guilt he'd never admitted to anyone, guilt about calling Eric Bat Boy, about organizing the social exile that made Bat sure no one sat with the blind kid, about stealing his lunch and tripping him in hallways, and generally making Eric's life miserable because it was easier to be cruel than to risk his own social standing by being kind. But watching 55 bikers show up just to sit with someone Dylan had spent years convincing everyone didn't matter. Something cracked open in his chest, some understanding that maybe he'd been wrong about everything. Mark saw him coming, saw the way the kid's hands were shaking, saw the mixture of fear and shame in his eyes, and he stood up slowly, positioning himself between Dylan and Eric, not as a threat, but as a barrier, a chance for this kid to prove he came in peace, rather than continuing the pattern of cruelty. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice neutral but not cold. Dylan's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, trying again. "I need to talk to Eric." "Why?" Kodiak asked from the adjacent table, his massive arms crossed over his chest in a posture that managed to be both casual and intimidating. "Because I need to apologize," Dylan said, and the words came out strangled, barely audible over the ambient noise of the cafeteria. "I need to tell him I'm sorry." Mark studied him for a long moment, reading the body language that came from years of assessing whether someone was genuine or dangerous, and he must have decided this kid was the former because he stepped aside slightly, giving Dylan space to approach, but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. "Eric, there's someone here who wants to talk to you." Eric's head turned toward the sound of Dylan's breathing. The boy had learned to identify people by their unique patterns of sound and movement, and his entire body went rigid when he recognized who it was. Dylan, his voice was small, uncertain, like someone expecting another blow and bracing for impact. "Yeah," Dylan managed. "It's me." He stood there awkwardly, looking at this small boy with thick, dark glasses and a white cane who he'd tormented for 3 years, and he felt like the worst person on earth, which, in this moment, he might have been. "I'm sorry, Eric. I'm really sorry." The cafeteria had gone quiet again, students recognizing that something important was happening, even if they didn't fully understand what. Teachers watching with the kind of attention that comes from knowing this moment could either heal something broken or make it worse. "Sorry for what?" Eric asked, and there was steel in his voice despite how small he sounded. Strength that came from enduring 900 days of cruelty and still having the courage to ask for specificity rather than accepting vague apologies. "For calling you names," Dylan said, his voice getting stronger as the words started flowing. "For tripping you, for stealing your lunch, for convincing everyone that you were weird, that sitting with you would make them weird too, for making you eat alone every day while I sat with my friends and laughed." He wiped his eyes. He was crying now, 11-year-old tears that were equal parts, shame and relief, because confession is heavy and catharsis is necessary. "I don't know why I did it. Maybe because you were different and I didn't understand you. Or maybe because being mean made me feel powerful. Or maybe because my dad taught me that people who are weak don't matter, and I thought being blind made you weak." He took a shaky breath. "But I was wrong. You're not weak. You're braver than I'll ever be." Eric sat very still, his hands gripping the edge of the lunch table so hard his knuckles had gone white, processing this apology that had come 3 years too late, but had still come, which was more than most bullies ever managed. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Is it because they're here? He gestured vaguely toward the Hell's Angels surrounding them. Are you just scared? Yeah, Dylan admitted, because lying would make this worse. I'm scared, but that's not why I'm apologizing. I'm apologizing because... He looked at Mark, at Kodiak, at the 55 men who'd ridden across Seattle just to sit with a kid everyone else ignored. Because I just watched 55 strangers drop everything to make sure you weren't alone, and I realized I'd been sitting 10 feet away from you every day for 3 years, and I never once asked if you were okay. These guys who supposedly are dangerous criminals showed more kindness to you in 1 hour than I've shown in my entire life. His voice broke completely. I'm sorry, Eric. I'm so sorry. Mark had been watching this exchange carefully, and something in Dylan's words rang true, not because the apology erased years of cruelty, but because the kid was owning it completely rather than making excuses, was demonstrating the kind of accountability that most adults never managed. Eric, Mark said quietly, this is your call. You don't owe him forgiveness if you're not ready to give it. But I will say this, apologies mean more when they're hard, when someone has to admit they were wrong in front of people watching. Dylan just did that. What you do with it is up to you. Eric was quiet for a long time, long enough that Dylan started to think maybe forgiveness wasn't coming, that maybe he'd destroyed something that couldn't be repaired with words alone. But then Eric spoke, his voice steady despite the tears still streaming down his face. Do you mean it? The apology? Yes, Dylan said without hesitation. I mean it. Then I forgive you, Eric answered. But I need you to understand something, Dylan. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt all the kids who wanted to be my friend but were too scared of what you'd do to them if they sat with me. You created a whole culture where being kind to me was dangerous. So if you really want to make this right, you need to fix that. You need to tell everyone that it's okay to sit with me now, that I'm not weird or less than or someone to avoid. His small hands were trembling, but his voice stayed strong. Can you do that? Dylan nodded so hard it looked like his head might come loose. Yes, I can do that. I will do that. Good, Eric said. Then we can start over. I don't forget what happened, but I'm willing to try again if you are. And right there in Roosevelt Elementary's cafeteria, with 55 Hell's Angels as witnesses and 200 students watching, Dylan Kruger extended his hand toward Eric Matthews in an offer of friendship that should have happened 3 years earlier, but was happening now. And Eric reached out with the kind of trust that takes immense courage after being hurt so many times, and their hands met across a table that had been an island of isolation for 900 days, but wouldn't be anymore. Mark felt his throat tighten watching this, felt the weight of witnessing redemption in real time, of seeing how showing up and applying pressure in the right place could crack open possibilities that hadn't existed before. Dylan, he said, waiting until the boy looked at him, what you just did took guts. Not everyone can admit they were wrong, especially in front of an audience. I respect that. He paused. But respect is earned through action, not words. You want to prove you meant that apology? Start sitting with Eric at lunch, every day. And when other kids ask why you're friends with him now, you tell them the truth that you were wrong about him, that being different isn't being less, and that real strength is having the courage to stand with someone instead of standing on them. I will, Dylan promised. I swear I will. Dr. Park appeared at Mark's elbow then, her expression complicated, part relief that this hadn't turned into a disaster, part shame that it had taken outsiders to solve a problem she'd been struggling with for years, part genuine respect for what these bikers had accomplished in one lunch period that her entire administrative team hadn't managed in 5 years. Mr. Thompson, can I speak with you? Mark followed her a few steps away from the tables, far enough for privacy, but close enough to keep Eric in his peripheral vision. Yes, ma'am, I underestimated you, Dr. Park said bluntly. When you called yesterday, I thought this was either a publicity stunt or some kind of intimidation tactic. I thought I was making a terrible decision allowing this to happen. But, she looked at Eric, at Dylan still standing beside him, at the way the entire cafeteria's energy had shifted from hostile to curious to something resembling hope. You accomplished in 1 hour what our counselors and anti-bullying programs haven't managed in 5 years. You made bullying socially unacceptable through sheer presence. How do we maintain this? How do we make sure it lasts after you leave? You don't rely on us, Mark answered. You rely on what we demonstrated. You show these kids that adults will actually take dramatic action to protect the vulnerable. That there are consequences, social consequences, not just detention for cruelty. You make it clear that this school stands with Eric and every kid like him, that being different doesn't make you less deserving of friendship. He crossed his arms, leather creaking. And you hold students accountable. Dylan just apologized because 55 bikers made him realize his behavior had consequences. But that accountability needs to come from you too, from teachers, from parents. Otherwise, this is just one good day in a sea of bad ones. Dr. Park nodded slowly. We have a school assembly scheduled for Wednesday. Would you be willing to speak, to tell these students what you told me? Mark considered it. Public speaking wasn't his favorite activity. He preferred the quiet authority of actions over words. But if it helped Eric, if it prevented the next kid from eating alone for 900 days. Yeah, I'll speak, but I'm bringing Eric with me. He's the one who had the courage to ask for help. He deserves to be part of this conversation. Agreed, Dr. Park said. Then more quietly, thank you, Mr. Thompson, for seeing something the rest of us missed. I didn't miss it because I'm better than you, Mark corrected. I saw it because I've been Eric. I know what it's like when everyone's around but nobody sees you. So when someone asks me to show up, I show up. That's not heroic. That's just being human. The lunch period ended 10 minutes later with the ringing of a bell that sent 200 students streaming toward their next classes. But before they left, something unprecedented happened. Kids started approaching Eric's table to introduce themselves, to ask if they could sit with him tomorrow, to apologize for avoiding him for so long. Emma Chen was first, the 9-year-old who'd been too scared in 2nd grade to be his friend, and she was crying as she said, "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough before. Can we start over?" Then others, Marcus Johnson, who'd wanted to invite Eric to his birthday party 2 years ago, but had been afraid. Sophia Rodriguez, who'd always wondered why Eric sat alone, but had never asked. Liam O'Connor, who'd felt bad about the bullying but hadn't known how to stop it. One by one, students who'd participated in Eric's isolation through action or inaction came to make amends, and Eric sat there with tears streaming down his face because he'd spent 900 days being invisible, and now suddenly everyone wanted to see him, everyone wanted to be his friend, and the emotional whiplash was almost too much to process. Mark watched from a distance, Kodiak standing beside him, and the VP said quietly, "We did good today, brother. We did what we should have," Mark corrected, "what everyone should have done 5 years ago." He looked at his chapter at 50, 5 men who'd ridden across Seattle in the rain to sit with a lonely kid, who'd risked their reputations and their time and their comfort, just to prove that when someone asks the Brotherhood for help, the Brotherhood answers. But yeah, we did good. They filed out of the cafeteria at 12:40, leaving as respectfully as they'd entered, and the last thing Mark saw before walking through those doors was Eric surrounded by new friends, laughing at something Dylan had said, his white cane propped against the table, and his face transformed from the isolated, sad boy Mark had met at Pike Place Market into someone who finally understood what it felt like to be included, to be valued, to matter. The ride back through Seattle was quiet, contemplative, each man processing what they'd just been part of, and when they reached the clubhouse, nobody rushed to leave. Everyone lingering in the parking lot like they were reluctant to let this moment end, because they'd proven something important today, something the world needed to see, that the scariest-looking men in America are sometimes the only ones brave enough to show up when someone needs help, that brotherhood means more than leather and motorcycles, and that sometimes fixing a broken world starts with sitting with one lonely kid at lunch. By Tuesday morning, the story had gone viral. Mark's phone had been buzzing non-stop since Monday evening when the first news segment aired on King 5 local Seattle station, showing footage of 55 Hells Angels walking into Roosevelt Elementary, interviewing Dr. Park, who called it the most effective anti-bullying intervention I've witnessed in 30 years of education, showing Eric's face blurred for privacy, but his voice clear as he said, "They showed up when nobody else would. They made me believe I matter." The segment ended with Mark's quote from the cafeteria. "When a kid who's been alone for 900 days asks for help, you show up. All of you. That's what brotherhood means." From there, it spread like wildfire. CNN picked it up by midnight. Fox News ran it during morning programming. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Eric Hassan Army and #Real Brotherhood and #Bikers Protect Kids. The Hells Angels national website crashed from traffic. Mark's personal phone had messages from journalists in New York, London, Tokyo, all wanting interviews, all wanting to understand how a motorcycle club that society labeled as criminals had accomplished what schools and parents and anti-bullying programs hadn't managed. But Mark wasn't focused on the media attention. He was focused on making sure this wasn't just a viral moment that faded when the next news cycle hit, that the impact on Eric's life was genuine and lasting, rather than a temporary spotlight that made things worse when the cameras left. So Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., he rode back to Roosevelt Elementary to meet with Dr. Park and discuss how to maintain the momentum they'd created. The principal's office was small and cluttered with paperwork and photos of students who'd graduated over the decades, and Dr. Park looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her coffee cup refilled 3 times during their 30-minute conversation, her voice hoarse from doing interviews all evening. "Mr. Thompson," she said, gesturing for him to sit in a worn chair across from her desk. "I've been in education for 32 years. I've seen anti-bullying campaigns come and go, seen policies implemented and ignored, seen students suffer while we try to figure out the right intervention. And in one lunch period, you changed the entire culture of this school." "I provided a catalyst," Mark corrected. "You and your teachers have to maintain it. What's your plan?" Dr. Park pulled out a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. "First, we're implementing mandatory weekly check-ins with Eric and any other student who reports feeling isolated. Not just counselor meetings, actual administrative attention, where I personally verify they have friends to sit with at lunch, that they're not being excluded or bullied. Second, we're revising our anti-bullying policy to include social exile as a form of harassment if students are deliberately excluding someone. That's now a disciplinary issue. Third, we're launching a lunch buddy program where older students are assigned to make sure younger students aren't eating alone." "Good start," Mark said. "What about Dylan?" "Kid apologized publicly, showed real remorse. You punishing him or using him?" "Both," Dr. Park answered. "He's serving detention for his past behavior 3 weeks, and he'll be writing an essay about why social cruelty is harmful. But I'm also making him a peer mentor in our new inclusion program. He'll be teaching other students about the impact of bullying, because sometimes reformed bullies are the best advocates for change." Mark nodded approvingly. "What about the assembly tomorrow? You still want me there?" "Desperately, Dr. Park said. "These kids need to hear from you directly. They need to understand why you came, what brotherhood means, why showing up matters. And Mr. Thompson, I want you to be honest with them. Don't sugarcoat your past or pretend the Hells Angels are saints. These students need to learn that people are complicated, that you can have a rough reputation and still do good things, that judging someone by appearance is exactly what led to Eric's isolation in the first place." "I can do that," Mark agreed. "But I want Eric on stage with me. He's the one who had the courage to ask for help. This is his story more than mine." Wednesday's assembly was held in Roosevelt Elementary's gymnasium at 10 a.m. All grades, kindergarten through 6th, assembled on bleachers that creaked under the weight of 400 students who were buzzing with excitement and curiosity, because word had spread that the biker president was coming back, that something important was about to happen. Teachers lined the walls looking nervous. Parents who'd taken time off work to attend sat in folding chairs near the back, and local news cameras were set up in the corners because this had become a national story and everyone wanted to see what happened next. Mark walked onto the gymnasium floor wearing his full cut, leather polished and patches visible, and the room fell silent, the same silence that had descended on the cafeteria Monday, that mixture of fear and fascination that comes from encountering someone who defies easy categorization. Eric walked beside him, his white cane tapping on the hardwood floor, his small hand gripping Mark's arm for guidance, and when they reached the microphone stand at center court, Mark knelt and whispered something in Eric's ear that made the boy smile. Dr. Park introduced them briefly. Mark Thompson, president of the Hells Angels, Seattle chapter, and Eric Matthews, 4th grader, and then stepped back, giving them the floor. Mark adjusted the microphone and looked out at 400 young faces, staring at him with varying degrees of awe and apprehension. "My name is Wire," he started, using his road name because that's who he was in the Brotherhood. "I'm 48 years old. I served 2 tours in Iraq with the Army Rangers, and for the past 15 years I've been part of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Your teachers probably told you that motorcycle clubs are dangerous, that we're criminals, that you should be scared of us. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong." The room shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the sanitized message they'd expected. "The Hells Angels have a complicated history," Mark continued. "We've made mistakes. Some of our members have done things that deserve criticism. We're not perfect, and I'm not here to pretend we are. But here's what I want you to understand. People are more than their reputation. Organizations are more than their worst moments. And sometimes the scariest-looking people are the only ones brave enough to do what's right when everyone else is too afraid or too comfortable to act." He gestured to Eric standing beside him. "Monday, I sat with Eric at lunch because he asked me to. Simple as that. He didn't know my reputation, couldn't see my leather, or my patches, or my tattoos. He just heard my voice at Pike Place Market and decided I didn't sound mean. So he asked if I could sit with him at school because he'd been eating lunch alone for 5 years, 900 days, while 400 students and dozens of teachers walked past his table every single day and did nothing." The gymnasium was silent now, students recognizing the implicit accusation. "Eric was alone because you decided he was different," Mark said, his voice getting harder. "Because he's blind, and that made you uncomfortable, so you avoided him. You didn't have to bully him, though some of you did. You just had to ignore him, to pretend he didn't exist, and that was enough to make him feel invisible." He paused. "But here's what I learned on Monday. Eric isn't the one who needed to change. You are." A girl in the front row, maybe 8 years old, started crying, and Mark softened his tone slightly because the goal wasn't to traumatize children, but to teach them something they'd remember forever. "I'm not saying this to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because you need to understand that kindness isn't hard, it's just uncomfortable sometimes. Sitting with someone who's different requires courage because you might get judged for it. But you know what takes more courage? Being Eric. Showing up to school every day, knowing you'll eat alone. Asking for help after being rejected for 5 years. That's real bravery." He looked down at Eric. "You want to say something, buddy?" Eric stepped forward, his hands finding the microphone stand, and his voice came through the speakers, small but steady. "I forgive you," he said, addressing the entire school, "all of you, for ignoring me, for calling me names, for making me feel like I didn't belong here. I forgive you because Mark taught me that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, it's about refusing to let what happened define me forever." He took a breath. "But I need you to promise me something. Promise that you'll never make another kid feel the way I felt. Promise that if you see someone eating alone, you'll sit with them." Promise that being different won't make someone invisible anymore. 400 students sat in complete silence, processing this request from a 10-year-old who'd endured more loneliness than most of them would experience in their entire lives. And then something remarkable happened. Emma Chen stood up from the bleachers and said, "I promise." And Marcus Johnson stood and said, "I promise." And Sophia Rodriguez and Liam O'Connor and dozens more, until the entire gymnasium was standing and promising in voices that ranged from whispers to shouts. And Eric was crying again, but this time from joy instead of pain. Mark let it go on for a full minute before raising his hand for quiet. "Last thing I want to say. Brotherhood isn't about leather cuts or motorcycles or looking tough. Brotherhood is about showing up. It's about taking care of people who need help, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or risky. It's about being the person who stands with someone instead of standing by while they suffer." He looked directly at Dylan Kruger, who was sitting in the third row looking both ashamed and determined. "Some of you hurt Eric. That's a fact. But facts don't have to be permanent. You can choose to be different starting today. You can choose to be the friend Eric needed 5 years ago." The assembly ended with Dr. Park announcing the new anti-bullying initiatives and the Lunch Buddy program, but what Mark remembered most was walking out of that gymnasium with Eric's hand in his and hearing 400 students chanting, "E-Rick, E-Rick, E-Rick," like he was a hero coming home from war, which, in a way, he was. 3 weeks after the cafeteria intervention, Mark pulled his bike into Roosevelt Elementary's parking lot on a Friday afternoon and found the scene completely transformed from that first Monday. Students were playing outside during recess, running, laughing, existing in that unself-conscious way kids do when they feel safe, and sitting on a bench near the basketball court was Eric, surrounded by 6 other students including Dylan Kruger, all of them talking animatedly about something Mark couldn't hear from this distance but could tell was important, by the way. Eric kept gesturing with his hands and the others kept leaning in to listen. Sarah met Mark near the entrance, and the difference in her was stark. She looked younger somehow, the weight of 5 years of worry lifted from her shoulders, her smile genuine instead of the exhausted mask she'd worn at Pike Place Market. "He has friends," she said without preamble, like she still couldn't quite believe it. "Real friends. Not kids being nice because they feel guilty, kids who actually want to spend time with him. Dylan's been here every day after school this week, helping Eric with math homework. Emma invited him to her birthday party next month. Marcus asked if Eric wanted to join the audio club they're starting. How's he handling it? Mark asked, watching Eric laugh at something Dylan said. That's a lot of social change after 5 years of isolation. Some days it's overwhelming, Sarah admitted. He comes home exhausted from interacting with people all day, needs time alone to recharge. But he's happy, Mr. Thompson. Actually happy. He told me yesterday that he doesn't dread going to school anymore, that he wakes up excited to see his friends. Her voice cracked. I didn't think that was possible 3 weeks ago. Mark had been coming by once a week since the assembly, checking in to make sure the momentum hadn't faded, that this wasn't just a temporary wave of guilt-induced kindness that would disappear when the novelty wore off. But every visit showed the same thing. Genuine transformation, not just in Eric's social life, but in the entire school culture. Teachers reported decreased bullying incidents across all grades. Parents were talking about the importance of inclusion at home. Students who'd previously been isolated were finding friends because the entire framework of social acceptance had shifted. Being kind was now cool, being inclusive was now expected, and anyone who tried to resurrect the old patterns of exclusion faced immediate peer pressure to stop. Can I talk to him? Mark asked. He'd love that. He asks about you constantly. When's Wire coming? Is Wire proud of me? Sarah smiled. You're his hero, you know. He wants to be a Hell's Angel when he grows up. Mark laughed despite himself. That's a conversation for when he's older. Let's focus on getting through elementary school first. He walked across the playground, and Eric's head turned immediately. The kid had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize people by their footsteps, by the particular rhythm and weight of their walk. "Mark," he called out, his face lighting up. "You came." "Told you I'd be here every Friday," Mark said, sitting on the bench beside him. "Who are your friends?" Eric introduced them one by one: Dylan, Emma, Marcus, Sophia, Liam, and a new kid named James, who'd transferred from another school 2 weeks ago, and whom Eric had immediately befriended because he remembered what it felt like to be new and alone. They were all looking at Mark with that mixture of respect and nervousness kids show when meeting someone they've been told is important, and Mark recognized the dynamic. He'd become a symbol to these students, a representation of what it meant to actually show up when someone needed help. "How's the Lunch Buddy program going?" Mark asked the group. "Really good," Emma answered, because apparently she'd become one of the program coordinators. "We've paired up every younger student with an older one, and nobody eats alone anymore. We have a sign-up sheet for kids who want to join lunch groups, and we do weekly check-ins to make sure everyone's included." "Dylan's been amazing," Eric added, reaching over to pat his former bully's shoulder. He apologized to like 20 kids he'd been mean to over the years, and now he's teaching a class about why bullying is harmful. Dylan looked embarrassed, but pleased. "It's not that big a deal." "It is," Mark interrupted. "Taking responsibility for harm you caused is huge. Most adults can't do it. You're 11, and you figured it out. That's something to be proud of." He looked at the whole group. "You're all doing something important here, creating a school culture where kindness matters more than popularity, where being different doesn't make you a target. That's the kind of change that ripples out beyond Roosevelt Elementary. You're teaching your generation to be better than the last one." They talked for another 20 minutes, Eric, telling stories about his week, about the audio club he'd joined, where students recorded podcasts about school events, about how he was teaching his friends to navigate with their eyes closed so they could understand his experience better, about how Dylan had convinced his corporate lawyer father to donate money for new accessibility technology in the library. It was ordinary conversation, the kind of catching-up chatter that happens between friends, but to Mark it represented something profound, proof that one dramatic action had created lasting change, that showing up hadn't been a publicity stunt, but a genuine intervention that had transformed lives. When Mark stood to leave, Eric asked the question he'd been asking every week. "Will you teach me about motorcycles, about what it's like to ride?" "When you're older," Mark promised, the same answer he always gave. "But I'll tell you what, when you turn 16, if you still want to learn, I'll teach you. We'll figure out a way to make it work even with the blindness. Deal?" "Deal," Eric said, grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. Mark was walking back to his bike when Dylan caught up with him, jogging across the playground with the kind of urgency that suggested something important was on his mind. "Mr. Thompson, wait." Mark stopped, turning to face the kid who'd been Eric's chief tormentor and was now his staunchest defender. "What's up, Dylan?" "I wanted to ask you something," Dylan said, a little breathless from the run. "About what you said at the assembly, about people being more than their worst moments." He shifted his weight from foot to foot, nervous energy that reminded Mark of soldiers about to go on patrol. "Do you really believe that? That people can change?" "I know they can," Mark answered. "I've seen it happen. Hell, I've lived it. You think I was always president of a motorcycle club? I made plenty of mistakes when I was younger, hurt people I cared about, let my anger control me, did things I'm not proud of, but I learned that who you've been doesn't have to be who you are. Change is possible if you're willing to do the work." Dylan nodded slowly, processing this. "I'm trying to do the work. I'm trying to be better, but some kids still don't trust me, and I don't blame them. But it's hard when you apologize, and people act like it doesn't count because you were too terrible before." "Change takes time," Mark said. "Trust has to be rebuilt brick by brick, action by action. You can't apologize once and expect everything to be forgiven immediately. But here's what I've learned. Consistency matters more than words. Keep showing up for Eric. Keep being kind to kids you used to bully. Keep teaching that class about why cruelty is harmful. Eventually, people will judge you by who you are now, instead of who you were then. He put a hand on Dylan's shoulder. You're doing good, kid. Don't give up just because it's hard. The best things usually are. Dylan looked like he might cry, but he held it together, nodding firmly. Thanks, Mr. Thompson, for coming that day, for showing me that I needed to change. You showed yourself, Mark corrected. I just provided the mirror. That evening, back at the Hells Angels clubhouse, Mark called another meeting, not emergency this time, but planned, because he had something important to discuss with his chapter. 55 men assembled again, the same ones who'd ridden to Roosevelt Elementary 3 weeks ago, and they settled into their usual spots with the comfortable ease of brothers who'd been through things together that civilians couldn't understand. Update on Eric. Mark started, and everyone leaned forward because they'd all been invested in this story since that first Sunday meeting. Kid's doing great. Has a whole friend group now, including the main bully who apologized and is making amends. Schools implemented new policies. Cultures changed. Nobody eats alone anymore. He paused. We did what we set out to do. We showed up, we made a statement, and we proved that the Hells Angels are more than society's stereotype. So we're done, Wrench asked. With Eric's school? Yeah, mostly. I'll keep checking in weekly, but the work there is done. Mark crossed his arms, leather creaking in the quiet room. But here's what I've been thinking. If it worked at Roosevelt Elementary, why can't it work other places? How many other kids are eating lunch alone right now while adults ignore them? How many schools need someone to show up and demonstrate that exclusion has consequences? Kodiak stood up, his massive frame unfolding. You saying we should make this a thing, like a formal program? Maybe, Mark answered. Not a publicity stunt, I'm talking about genuine intervention, when schools or families reach out saying they've got a kid who's isolated and bullying programs aren't working. We ride in, we sit with the kid, we make it clear that exclusion isn't acceptable. We become the nuclear option for anti-bullying. The room erupted in discussion, some men excited about the possibility, others concerned about logistics and liability, everyone processing what it would mean to turn one dramatic gesture into a repeatable program. Stitch raised his hand for quiet. How do we make sure we're actually helping and not just creating viral moments? How do we ensure the impact lasts? Follow up, Mark answered. Weekly check-ins like I've been doing with Eric. Coordination with school administration. Making it clear that our involvement isn't a one-time show, but the beginning of a partnership where we hold schools accountable for maintaining the changes we help create. He looked around the room. I'm not saying we have to do this. I'm saying we have the opportunity to turn one good thing into a movement. But it only works if we're committed to doing it right. I'm in, Kodiak said immediately. Me too, Wrench agreed. Count me in, Stitch added. One by one, the entire chapter voted yes, not because they wanted attention or credit, but because they'd seen firsthand how much difference it made when adults actually showed up to protect vulnerable kids, and because being Hells Angels had always been about more than motorcycles and leather. It had been about brotherhood, about loyalty, about standing with people who needed someone in their corner, even when society said they weren't worth the effort. All right then, Mark said, feeling something shift in his chest, pride, maybe, or purpose, or the understanding that sometimes redemption comes not from erasing your past, but from using your reputation for something good. Let's make this official. We'll call it Friend Forever, taken from our charter motto. When a kid needs an army, we send one. When isolation becomes dangerous, we intervene. When schools fail to protect their vulnerable students, we show them what accountability looks like. The Hells Angels Seattle chapter launched Friend Forever, officially in early December, creating a website where families and schools could reach out for help, establishing protocols for intervention that respected school policies while maintaining their dramatic impact, coordinating with education officials to ensure their involvement was seen as partnership rather than vigilante justice. Within 2 months, they'd received requests from 8 schools across Washington state, each one describing a student who'd been isolated for months or years, each one asking if the Hells Angels could work their magic again. And they did, every time. 6 months after that first lunch at Roosevelt Elementary, Mark stood in the parking lot of Lincoln Middle School in Spokane, Washington, watching as 43 Hells Angels assembled for their 6th Friend Forever intervention, this time for a 12-year-old girl named Maya, who'd been eating lunch alone since her family immigrated from Guatemala 2 years ago, and she'd been labeled the weird foreign kid by classmates who didn't understand that being different wasn't a character flaw. The ride from Seattle had taken 4 hours, but every man had made the trip willingly, taking vacation days or calling in favors to clear their schedules because they'd all seen what happened when you showed up for someone who'd been abandoned by everyone else. You didn't just save one kid, you changed an entire culture. You demonstrated that kindness was stronger than cruelty and presence was more powerful than reputation. But Mark wasn't thinking about Maya right now, he was thinking about Eric, because today was special for a different reason. Back in Seattle, at Roosevelt Elementary School, Eric Matthews was being honored at an assembly recognizing his courage in asking for help and his work over the past 6 months as a peer mentor, helping other isolated students find friends and acceptance. Dr. Park had called Mark that morning to tell him about the award, to say that Eric had specifically requested that Mark be there because Wire taught me that asking for help is brave, and I want him to see what happened because he showed up. Mark had wanted to be there desperately, wanted to see Eric receive recognition that was 5 years overdue, but he'd also committed to being in Spokane for Maya, and Hells Angels kept their promises. So he'd called Eric that morning to apologize, to explain that he couldn't make the assembly because another kid needed help. Eric's response had been immediate and certain. Then you have to go help them. That's more important than an award. Promise me you'll show up for them the way you showed up for me. And Mark had promised, because how could he say no to a request like that? How could he prioritize ceremony over action when Eric himself understood that the whole point of Friend Forever was choosing presence over convenience? But standing in Spokane's parking lot, preparing to walk into another cafeteria to sit with another lonely kid, Mark felt the weight of what they'd started. Not burden exactly, but responsibility. 6 interventions in 6 months meant 6 kids whose lives had changed because 55 men in leather cuts decided that brotherhood meant protecting the vulnerable regardless of social cost. But it also meant 6 schools where the culture had shifted, 6 communities where parents were talking about inclusion at dinner tables, 6 ripple effects spreading outward in ways they couldn't fully track or measure. "You good, brother?" Kodiak asked, appearing at Mark's elbow, with the kind of timing that comes from 15 years of riding together. Thinking about Eric, Mark admitted. About how this all started with one kid asking for help at a farmer's market. And now we're in Spokane doing it again. Kodiak finished. That's what movements look like. They start small, with one person brave enough to ask, and they spread because people see it's possible. He gestured to the school building where teachers were gathering near the entrance to meet them. You change one thing, Wire. You proved that showing up matters more than reputation, that actions speak louder than stereotypes, that sometimes the scariest-looking people are the only ones willing to do what's right. That's worth being proud of. They walked into Lincoln Middle School at 11:45, 43 Hells Angels, this time because some of the Seattle chapter had obligations they couldn't break, but 43 was still an army, still more than enough to make the statement they needed. Maya was sitting alone in the cafeteria at a corner table, small for her age, wearing a bright pink shirt and looking like she was trying to make herself invisible. And when Mark approached and said, "Hey, Maya, my name's Wire. Mind if we join you for lunch?" her face transformed with the same mixture of disbelief and hope that Eric's had 6 months ago. "You came?" she whispered in accented English. "All of you came for me?" "All of us," Mark confirmed, "because nobody should have to eat lunch alone, ever." The intervention followed the same pattern as Roosevelt bikers sitting at surrounding tables, creating a wall of protection that made it impossible for anyone to ignore Maya's isolation anymore. Principal addressing students about inclusion and accountability, bullies apologizing under the weight of social pressure, culture shifting in real time as 400 students learned that exclusion had consequences more powerful than detention or lectures. But what made this one different, what made Mark's throat tighten and his eyes burn, was the moment halfway through lunch when Maya pulled out her phone with trembling hands and showed him a video that had been shared on social media. That morning, it was Eric, standing on stage at Roosevelt Elementary's assembly, accepting his award for outstanding peer mentorship and courage in advocacy, and his speech was being broadcast on a phone screen in a middle school cafeteria 4 hours away from where it was given. "My name is Eric Matthews," the video, Eric said, his voice steady and clear through the phone's small speaker. 6 months ago, I was eating lunch alone every day. I'd been alone for 5 years, 900 days, and I didn't think anything would ever change. But then I asked a stranger for help, and he said yes. Not just him, 55 of his brothers said yes, and they showed me something important, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. The cafeteria at Lincoln Middle School had gone quiet. Students recognizing that something significant was happening, that this wasn't just another intervention but a movement spreading across state lines. "Today, I'm not alone anymore." Video, Eric continued. "I have friends, real friends, and I've learned that the reason I was alone for so long wasn't because I was weird or broken or less than. It was because other people were too scared or too comfortable to be kind. So if you're watching this and you know someone who sits alone at lunch, someone who gets excluded because they're different, be brave. Sit with them. Include them. Show them they matter. Because that's what Wire and the Hells Angels taught me. Showing up is everything." The video ended with Eric holding up his award, a plaque that read, "Friend Forever," for teaching us that courage is asking and kindness is answering. And Maya was crying, and Mark was crying, and half the cafeteria was crying because they'd just witnessed proof that one act of kindness could echo across time and distance, could inspire change in places the original actors would never visit. "He did that for me," Maya whispered. "Someone I've never met made a video to tell people to be nice to me." "He did it for everyone," Mark answered, "because Eric understands that loneliness is universal, that exclusion hurts the same, whether you're in Seattle or Spokane or anywhere else. He wanted people to know that it gets better when someone shows up. And it did get better at Lincoln Middle School, at Roosevelt Elementary, at 6 schools across Washington state where the Hells Angels had intervened over 6 months, proving that dramatic action combined with sustained follow-up could transform school cultures in ways policies and programs alone never managed. The Friend Forever initiative continued to grow, expanding beyond Washington into Oregon and Idaho, with other motorcycle clubs reaching out to ask how they could replicate the model in their own communities. But Mark never forgot that it all started with one blind 10-year-old at Pike Place Market, standing in front of a stranger wearing a leather vest covered in patches he couldn't see, asking the bravest question in the world, "Can you sit with me at lunch?" 3 years later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May, Mark pulled his motorcycle into the parking lot of a community center in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood and found Eric waiting for him, 13 years old now, taller, confident, standing without the defensive posture he'd had at 10, white cane in hand but held casually rather than defensively. Beside him stood his mother, Sarah, Dylan Kruger, who'd become Eric's best friend and fiercest defender, and a group of about 20 other students from Roosevelt Elementary who'd been part of that first transformation 3 years ago. "Hey, buddy," Mark said, removing his helmet and crossing to give Eric a hug. "What's this about? Your mom said you needed to talk to me about something important." "I'm starting a program," Eric announced, his voice filled with the kind of excited energy that comes from having a vision you believe in completely. "It's called Ask and Answer, based on what you taught me. The idea is to teach students that asking for help is courageous, and that when someone asks, you have to answer. We're going to train peer mentors at schools across the country, create support networks for isolated kids, teach educators how to identify and address social exclusion before it becomes chronic." He paused for breath. "And I want you to be part of it, not as the face of the program that should be students like me who've lived through isolation, but as an advisor, as someone who shows educators and parents what it looks like when adults actually take dramatic action to protect kids." Mark felt his throat tighten, felt the weight of understanding that the 10-year-old he'd met at Pike Place Market had grown into someone who was going to change the world in ways that made the Hells Angels intervention look small by comparison. "Eric, that's incredible. I'm honored you want me involved." "It wouldn't exist without you," Eric said simply. "You showed me that I mattered. Now I want to show other kids the same thing, that their loneliness isn't permanent, that asking for help is possible, that somewhere out there is an adult who will actually show up when you need them." He shifted his weight, suddenly seeming younger again, more vulnerable. "Also, I turn 16 next month, and you promised me that when I turned 16, you'd teach me about motorcycles." Mark laughed despite the tears threatening to spill. "I did promise that, didn't I?" "You did," Eric confirmed. "And Hell's Angels keep their promises." So, 2 weeks later, Mark took Eric to a closed parking lot in South Seattle, where the Hells Angels sometimes practiced formation riding, and he taught a blind 16-year-old about motorcycles, not through sight, but through sound and touch and trust. He let Eric feel the engine's vibration, taught him to identify different bike models by their exhaust notes, explained how balance and movement worked through tactile demonstration rather than visual instruction. And on Eric's birthday, with Kodiak and Wrench and Stitch and 50 other Hells Angels watching, Mark took Eric on his first ride. Not fast, not dangerous, just a slow loop around the parking lot, with Eric holding onto Mark's vest and laughing with pure joy as wind whipped past his face and he experienced the freedom that 2 wheels and open road represented. "I can't see where we're going," Eric said when they stopped, his voice filled with wonder. "But I can feel it. I can feel everything." "That's what riding is," Mark answered. "Trusting someone else to see the road while you feel the journey." And standing there in that parking lot, surrounded by brothers who'd spent 3 years showing up for isolated kids across the Pacific Northwest, Mark realized that's what Friend Forever had always been about, teaching people to trust, that someone would see the road ahead while they found the courage to feel their way forward, to ask for help, to believe that showing up mattered more than reputation or fear or the weight of what society said was possible. Eric Matthews asked a Hells Angel to sit with him at lunch 3 years ago, and that single act of courage had rippled outward into a movement that changed school cultures, transformed lives, and proved that sometimes the scariest-looking people are the only ones brave enough to answer when someone whispers, "Can you help me? I'm alone." And the Hells Angels had answered. Every single time. Because that's what brotherhood means, showing up when someone needs you, no matter who they are, no matter what anyone thinks, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable or risky it might be. That's the promise. Friend forever. Forever friend. And Wyatt Thompson kept his promises. Always. If you believe that showing up for someone who's been abandoned is what real brotherhood looks like, then like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe now for more stories. Also, check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you.